What would have happened if the dinosaurs didn't go extinct? What if 66 million years ago, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs instead had missed? Would something like human intelligence and civilization and our technology have appeared? Maybe, but maybe not. I'm going to argue that dinosaurs may have had very different evolutionary constraints and potentials than mammals did, but also that the asteroid impact may have fundamentally altered the direction of evolution, the evolution of life on Earth, pushing off in a completely different trajectory. So if the asteroid hadn't hit, it's very unlikely that something like us would be here. So 66 million years ago, a 6-mile wide asteroid hits the Earth with the force of billions of atomic bombs. And the epicenter of the impact is on the edge of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, directly above what is now the small town of Chicxulub. So this is the Chicxulub impact crater, and this is the Chicxulub asteroid impact. The impact would shoot dust and soot into the atmosphere, plunging the planet into darkness, and temperatures would plunge. So photosynthesis stops, plants and plankton died, animals that are eating and depending on plants and plankton starve, their predators starve. A lot of things probably just froze to death as it got very cold. But anyway, a huge number of species disappeared. Possibly something like 90% or 95% of all species on the planet go extinct at this point, probably within a span of a couple of years. Probably a lot of them were wiped out in the initial weeks and months, and others would have disappeared later. And this would include all dinosaurs except for a handful of bird species. Mammals, however, survived. Now, there's a kind of misconception that like, oh, well, mammals weren't affected. Mammals did relatively well if your comparison is 100% extinction, which is what most of the dinosaur groups saw, except for birds. Even a few percent survival is success, and that was the success of mammals, is they suffered very high levels of extinction. Probably 90 to 95% of mammal species were wiped out, but compared to dinosaurs, that's pretty good. So somewhere between maybe a few dozen mammal species, maybe as many as 100 mammal species survive out of the thousands of mammals that would have existed this time. And the survivors stage a massive adaptive radiation. They're taking advantage of the disappearance of their competitors and also their chief predators. Dinosaurs were competing with them for food, but also eating a lot of these mammals. They're the major predator of mammals, most likely. So mammals stage this major adaptive radiation. We see things like, bats and horses and whales are all appearing in the aftermath as they move into these new niches. Among the survivors are these very primitive mammals that they're the ancestors of primates, and they probably didn't look like a monkey, but they would have looked rather like a tree shrew. So this kind of vaguely shrew-like or insectivore-like animal, but these tree shrews are actually closer to us. And they probably are a pretty good stand-in for what the ancestor of the primates would have looked like. And in the 10 million years after the extinction, these tree shrew-like primates that survived the mass extinction event will diversify and give rise to the first true primates. These are animals that have binocular vision, big eyes like us, and opposable digits, and they're highly arboreal and highly specialized for arboreal life. And then these will eventually give rise to monkeys, which give rise to apes, and eventually give rise to us. So the extinction of the dinosaurs triggers the evolution of primates, which ultimately leads to us. It is the event, the inciting event, you could argue, in human evolution. So the big question is, if the extinction of the dinosaurs led to us, if they didn't go extinct, would something like us, not us obviously, but like us have appeared? Would potentially dinosaurs have evolved into something that occupies our niche today? Would they've evolved an intelligent tool-using species, highly social with language, sophisticated tools, agriculture, civilizations, mathematics, nuclear weapons, a space program? Imagine highly evolved raptors planting the flag on the moon. Imagine dinosaur scientists discovering relativity and making nuclear bombs. Maybe even dinosaur evolutionary biologists and discussing an alternate history, a hypothetical world in which, incredibly, get this, dinosaurs went extinct and mammals became the dominant species instead of the dinosaurs. So we can imagine this alternative universe in which dinosaurs dominated. And does it look anything like our universe or not? Now, this might sound like science fiction, but this thought experiment gets at a really fundamental problem, a really important philosophical question about evolution's workings. Why are we here? Does the universe have to be the way it is, or could it have turned out to be very different than it is? Does the biological universe, the biological world, have to take this particular form, or is the emergence and dominance of a human or human-like species inevitable, or just chance and luck? So this is a really profound question. Are there patterns in certain things, like intelligent tool users are highly likely to evolve on Earth and maybe elsewhere in the universe, or is it just kind of a fluke we're here? Is it just the fact that the asteroid happened to hit the Earth instead of, having a near miss? Now, you could argue, I think you can actually make a very good argument that something like us is bound to evolve. We are a really remarkable design. Objectively, humans are remarkably successful. Like, okay, yeah, there's only one species and there's millions of insects. But there are more than 8 billion Homo sapiens on the planet, on all 7 continents, on these distant ocean islands. In terms of biomass, there are more humans than there are wild mammals and birds in the world. And most of the rest of the biomass out there is livestock, things like cows and chickens and sheep. So, we dominate, and then the species that we feed on dominate, and we are just objectively a highly special, successful species. So humans, we rule the planet. We have modified a huge amount of the Earth's land to feed ourselves. We've converted over to rangeland for cattle and sheep, and we have converted to farmland. We have huge tracts of forest that we farm for timber and for paper and things like that. We have forced plants and animals to evolve to provide our food. We have tamed cows and sheep, and we have tamed chickens and dogs and all these animals. We have domesticated crops like corn and wheat and rice. So we've changed the biological world to give us calories, and we're altering the climate. No other species can do this or ever has done this. No other species commands as much land and energy and resources and other species the way we do, or controls the environment the way we do. So I'm going to argue that we've hit on a highly successful, highly effective strategy, a combination of big brains. We have our complex thinky thoughts. We have a sophisticated language. We have thumbs that we can use to make tools and manipulate the world around us. We have these very large, complex social groups. And all this has made us Earth's dominant species, for better or for worse. This seems like a winning strategy. I mean, it sure beats out the evolutionary strategy of the mammoths and ground sloths that we hunted to extinction. Now, given the success of this strategy, it seems like eventually, given enough time, millions and millions of years, evolution would hit on it sooner or later. It's such a good idea. Eventually, they're going to invent this strategy, right? So evolution adapts species to environments over time, over millions and billions of years, millions of iterations, billions of different species. Sooner or later, you'd hit on something broadly like us, maybe not exactly like us, but that fills our niche. So maybe dinosaurs, given time, would have as well. This brings us to the Dinosauroid. This is a thought experiment. It might seem a little silly, a little corny, like something out of an old sci-fi movie or something, but there's actually a profoundly interesting question behind this. Is like, what if the dinosaurs didn't go extinct? Would they produce something vaguely like us? And the Dinosauroid was proposed as a thought experiment in the 1970s by the paleontologist Dale Russell. And in his thought experiment, a carnivorous dinosaur, perhaps something related to troodontid, which was, one of the largest brain dinosaurs, would have evolved into an intelligent tool user. And it looks something like us. It walks, it's an upright biped with opposable thumbs, but it's only got three digits being a theropod rather than a primate. It's this big-brained, upright biped, kind of looks a bit like a space alien. And this assumes that our design is a good one, so dinosaurs would be likely to hit on it as well. Now, you can imagine that an intelligent tool user might not look exactly like this if it comes from a dinosaur. Maybe to have a horizontal spine like your typical raptor. Of course, probably feathery, we now know, because these things had feathers, and we didn't discover that until relatively recently. But more generally, even if you want to quibble about the specific details of the Dinosauroid, the really interesting question here is it likely that dinosaurs would have evolved into something like us if that asteroid hadn't wiped them out first? Now, what I'm going to argue is that it's probably not impossible, but it might not be very likely either. And the reason why is that starting points dictate endpoints. The anatomy and biology and developmental patterns of an organism impose constraints on its evolution. Your evolutionary starting points determine your possible endpoints. Not all outcomes are equally likely or even possible from each starting point. So where you start from limits where you can go. Not all evolutionary pathways are open to all species. Sometimes, like they say, you just can't get there from here. So one way we can look at this is to think of it in terms of the metaphor of adaptive landscapes. Now, the adaptive landscape is kind of a theoretical construct. It doesn't really exist, but it's a way of seeing the world. Imagine these multidimensional trait spaces. We can have things like, the size of an organism, its metabolic rate, its intelligence, all these different traits, and this multidimensional space. And then we have another axis, the height axis. The y-axis gives you your fitness. So across this trait space, you'll see that certain combinations of traits have very low fitness. Other combinations have higher fitness. Others have very high fitness. And the idea is that natural selection can only select for more adaptive traits, so it inevitably moves you upwards on this adaptive landscape. It can only push you upwards onto the peaks. It can't push you down into the valleys. So once you rise up one of these peaks, it then may become impossible to access another adaptive peak. You become isolated. So the implication is that choices made millions of years ago by evolution pushing a particular direction millions of years ago, might constrain where you can go millions or tens of millions of years into the future. Now we can imagine more complex adaptive landscapes. Imagine some sort of, like in this example, an adaptive valley, and in a region of lowest fitness, and on either side of that we have ridges and peaks rising up. And the trick is that climbing up one set of slopes takes you to one set of peaks, or maybe one peak, and climbing up the other side would take you in a different direction. So once you start down this evolutionary pathway, that limits what you can now access. So maybe instead of an adaptive peak, we can think of in terms of adaptive mountain ranges, clusters of connected peaks and plateaus that a lineage can explore as it diversifies. And lineages enter an adaptive mountain range and start exploring, climbing up different peaks and producing hundreds, thousands, millions of different species. Another lineage enters a separate range and starts climbing up a different set of adaptive peaks, and they just start exploring different trait space, and they start coming up with different adaptations, but they'll never evolve in exactly the same way because they have these different starting points, or rather they've climbed up different slopes, and you can't really access one adaptive mountain range from another because they're separated by this adaptive valley. Consider, if you want to think of it in terms of a human life, think of how our lives are constrained by our past choices. One of the big choices you can make in life is, do you go to college and graduate or not? And some people go to college, and some people go to college and drop out, or just don't go at all. Now, if you didn't go to college or dropped out, you'll probably never be a brain surgeon. You'll probably never be a lawyer. You'll probably never be a politician. You'll probably never be a NASA scientist. On the other hand, there are a lot of other opportunities open to you. You could still be a great artist, a novelist, a musician, an actor, an entrepreneur. So there's a lot of things you can do. I'm not saying, your life is ruined because you didn't go to college, but it does constrain what you can do. And then the flip side is true as well. I mean, if you go to college and then go to med school, you're probably never going to be a rock star or a tech multi-billionaire. So the paths we take in life, they will open certain doors and close other doors. And the same is true, I'd argue, in evolution. Some paths are closed. Something broadly similar is true in evolution in the sense that taking one path opens certain possibilities and closes the other paths. So the problem with assuming that dinosaurs could evolve into something like a human is that this evolutionary pathway just might, for various reasons we might not understand, might not have been open to the dinosaurs the way it was to the mammals. Consider birds, for example. I mean, this is kind of an interesting example. Birds are the descendants of dinosaurs, or modified dinosaurs. And we can see that certain adaptive pathways are open to them that might not be open to other animals, and vice versa. So in avian evolution, we'll see certain things evolve over and over. And one thing we see that evolves repeatedly in birds are wing-propelled flightless divers. So today we have the penguins, but in historic times we had another lineage, the great auk. This was an extinct flightless auk. It's related to things like razorbills and puffins, not closely related to penguins. It evolves independently. And we go back further in time, and there's another lineage that evolved these flightless wing-propelled divers, the Plotopterids in the Pacific. And I think there's even another lineage of auks that evolves flightlessness. So this happens something like 4 separate times. This is clearly a viable evolutionary pathway, if you're a bird at least. Another pathway we can think of that birds have repeatedly exploited that's highly viable for them is to become very large flightless herbivores. So we have these birds called ratites. They include things like ostriches, rheas, emus, cassowaries, moas. They're not the flightlessness rather evolves independently in all these guys. They don't come from a flightless ancestor. They come from a flying ancestor that look kind of like a tinamou, one of their closest relatives. It's actually nested inside this group. So we see birds evolving repeatedly in these 2 pathways. They evolve wing-propelled flightless divers and these flightless terrestrial forms. So hey, this seems like a viable evolutionary pathway for a flying animal, right? Well, let's look at some other flying animals. Let's look at bats, for example. Bats never evolved aquatic forms, let alone wing-propelled diving bats. That never happens. They never evolve large terrestrial herbivore forms. There's no equivalent of ratites among the bats. Their anatomy just seems to be very poorly suited to evolving in this direction. They don't swim particularly well, so they're not going to evolve wing-propelled divers. They don't walk very well, so they're not going to evolve terrestrial herbivores. These roles appear to be largely closed off to them. We can also look at pterosaurs. Pterosaurs never evolved wing-propelled divers. As far as we know, they didn't evolve flightless ratite-like herbivores either. So again, it may be that like the bats, they're just not very good swimmers. Maybe they're not good at running and walking as birds. So these evolutionary pathways are closed, or at least far less probable for these animals than they were for the birds. So the converse is also true. There are things that bats do and pterosaurs do that birds never did. Bats, for example, own the night skies. Bats develop very sophisticated sonar because they have these really sophisticated ears that mammals have, and they're able to take over as airborne nocturnal insectivores in a way that birds never really were. And birds really can't touch them in this niche, and they've got about 1,000 species doing that. So yeah, bats can't be wing-propelled divers, but they're really good at this nocturnal insect hunting role. And the same is true of the pterosaurs. So pterosaurs did not do all the things birds did. But one thing pterosaurs did was produce these giant flying forms, things with 30-foot wingspans. This probably evolved several different times. And so they have opportunities open to them that aren't open to birds. So birds can do things that bats and pterosaurs can't, and vice versa. So let's think of this. Let's explore how this works for the dinosaurs. Are there evolutionary pathways open to dinosaurs that aren't open to mammals? And is the reverse also true, that there are things mammals can do that dinosaurs can't? The most obvious thing we can look at, but I think actually a really important biologically interesting property of dinosaurs, is the size. They're big. Everybody knows that. Every 5-year-old knows that. But it takes a PhD to try and tell you why they're big, and we still can't really explain it. But they are big. We know that much. Something about dinosaur biology, something about their metabolism, their physiology, their respiratory system, something, maybe their reproductive strategy, something allowed dinosaurs to get big. They were uniquely capable among all animals of evolving extraordinarily large size. So let's look at the sauropods. Starting in the Jurassic, these long-necked dinosaurs will repeatedly evolve just ridiculously huge size. So and this happens repeatedly. The ancestral sauropod was big, but it wasn't like, ginormous. And then independently, several different sauropod lineages will grow up to around 100 feet long, if not longer, and 50 or 60 tons in weight. We don't really know how big these things got because it's kind of hard to estimate the mass. A lot of these animals are highly incomplete. We have nothing quite like them alive today, but we know they're really big no matter how you look at it. And these supergiants, which is 30 tons or more, evolved something like 8 or 10 times, maybe more. We keep finding more of these supergiant dinosaurs, so we don't actually have as good a record of them as you might think. And we can ask why this is. And there's broadly speaking, two hypotheses. Something about their environment let them get big, or something about intrinsic to the sauropods themselves allowed them to get big. So was it just something about their environment? And I think probably not. The reason why is the giants evolved on multiple continents. They lived in different environments that had different foods at different times. In the Jurassic, they're eating a lot of conifers and cycads and ferns. In the Cretaceous, they're eating a lot of flowering plants. That implies it's not their food. And they're doing it, again, in different climate regimes. There are supergiants in the sweltering hot greenhouse world of the Cenomanian around 100 million years ago. And the much cooler Maastrichtian period around 66 million years ago, we also have these supergiants appearing. So the fact that the supergiants are appearing at different times, different places, different climates, different foods are available, different floras, is really interesting. And the other interesting thing is that only one dinosaur lineage does this. So if it was environmental, you would expect to see other dinosaurs doing this, like the duckbills and the ceratopsians, and they don't. It's only sauropods. So the implication is that something about them, again, it could be their bones, it could be the fact they have the lungs and the air sac system invading the bones, lets them get big and lets them shed heat or saves weight or something, or growth patterns, something about their biology allows them to become really large in a way that no other animal had before and no other animal has ever since. We also see this pattern in the theropod dinosaurs. Theropod dinosaurs don't get as big as the herbivores. Typically, your predators are smaller than your herbivores in an ecosystem, but they get really, really big. They evolve these 30-foot long predators, 5 tons or more in mass. And this happens again repeatedly in different groups. So we're seeing this happen, 5 tons approaching or exceeding in things like the megalosaurids, in the allosaurids, the carcharodontosaurids, neovenaturids, and finally in the tyrannosaurids. And these become these huge apex predators over the course of 100 million years. So the mammals never got as big as the sauropods, at least not on land. They get to around 15 or 20 tons, which is maybe 30 to 40% the size of the biggest sauropods. And that's the herbivorous mammals, of course, but the same is true of the carnivorous mammals. They never get as big as the biggest carnivorous dinosaurs. The biggest living carnivore, the Siberian tiger, is only about, 700 pounds. Some of the extinct ones may have gotten as big as 1,000 pounds, and this is less than 10% the size of the biggest carnivorous dinosaurs, things like T-Rex. So something about mammal biology seems to have been incompatible with the gigantism that dinosaurs routinely achieved. And again, the same is true of a lot of dinosaurs, actually. So we think about dinosaurs as being really big, but for most dinosaurs, like the ceratopsians and the duckbills, the iguanodontids, etc., they never produce these 30 to 50 ton giants. They're not capable of getting as big as the sauropods. So dinosaurs have different constraints than mammals, but even within dinosaurs, certain groups have unique capabilities that the other groups did not have. So, we're seeing constraints. There are constraints on how big you can get. Sauropods somehow broke through that constraint, and their body plan allows them to become much larger than other animals. And extraordinarily, in the several 100 million years that animals have been evolving on land, that only happens once. The sauropods are the only group that does it. Nobody did it before. Nobody did it at the same time in the dinosaur era. No other group was able to become that big, and no group has ever done it since. So they're the only group that has solved this problem of how do you make a 50-ton terrestrial herbivore, which is fascinating when you think about it. And again, why is that? Well, I have a PhD. I can wave my arms, but I can't give you a definitive answer why it is they got that big. Just lots and lots of theories. Now, so dinosaurs do big bodies well. It's the thing that's kind of most obvious about them. Not so much big brains. Now, dinosaurs had bigger brains than lizards and crocodiles and turtles and things like that. It's true. They're not quite as small brained as we used to think. And some of them are kind of approaching the levels of, or not quite getting to modern bird levels. And we also see a trend towards an increase in brain size over the course of the Jurassic to late Cretaceous. So at the end of the reign of dinosaurs is when we find the largest brain dinosaurs, things like duckbill dinosaurs, which had the biggest brains among the herbivores, and tyrannosaurs and, velociraptor, troodons, things like that. These are the largest brain dinosaurs, and they occur at the very end. There does seem to be a trend towards increased brain size, but we never really see them evolving really large complex brains like you get in mammals. So dinosaurs, their evolution isn't static. They diversify over time. They move into new niches. Towards the end, it seems like we have a much higher diversity of small herbivores. The birds diversify. We have longer-legged forms appearing, things like ornithomimids, suggesting an arms race between fleet-footed predators and their prey. We're seeing the evolution of elaborate horns on horned dinosaurs and herds and duck-billed dinosaurs, suggesting increasingly complex social lives. So dinosaur evolution isn't totally static, but it's not radically different, I'd argue, at the end of the Cretaceous than the Jurassic. We have these giant long-necked herbivores. We have these big bipedal predators. The ecosystem structure is broadly similar, and that raises the question of whether their evolution could have just kind of continued on that trajectory forever. Maybe without an asteroid impact, you would have seen Tyrannosaurids would have gotten a bit bigger than T-Rex. The arms would have gotten a bit shorter. Your Titanosaurs would have gotten a little bit bigger, et cetera, et cetera. But probably not something radically different. It doesn't really seem like they're in a hurry to evolve something like a dinosauroid. If they were going to do it before the asteroid wiped them out, then why don't we see them evolving towards that, in the Cretaceous period? So my sense is that there's little in the 100 million years or so of dinosaur evolution from the Jurassic Cretaceous hinting that they really would have done anything radically different if that asteroid hadn't hit. Again, I think a dinosaur-dominated present would look a lot like the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, not dinosaurs with space programs. Meanwhile, mammals have this entirely different set of evolutionary constraints and possibilities open to them. So mammals will never produce these giant herbivores and carnivores the way dinosaurs did. There is no mammalian equivalent of an Argentinosaurus, a 50-ton herbivore. There is no mammalian equivalent of a Tyrannosaurus rex or a Carcharodontosaurus. But they repeatedly evolved very large, complex brains. We see in whales, elephants, dogs, cats, seals, and primates, we have these great big brains and very complex behavior. And it suggests that if you want to evolve a highly intelligent species, a mammal is a really good starting place, and a dinosaur not so much. And again, we see different constraints and possibilities even within mammals. In the same way, not all dinosaurs are equally able to evolve large size, not all mammals are equally able to evolve large brain size. So when we talk about big brain mammals, we are speaking specifically about one group, the placental mammals. Marsupial mammals never got brains as big as chimpanzees and monkeys, and neither did the monotremes. Platypi have pretty small brains. Marsupials have pretty small brains. So even within the mammals, there are constraints in the same way that there are different constraints in different dinosaur groups. Only sauropods could produce these supergiant bodies. Only placentals could evolve supergiant brains. Different groups have different constraints and different possibilities open to them. So maybe dinosaurs are just better at evolving large size, not so much big brains. Mammals are better at evolving high intelligence, but not great at evolving large size. They seem to have each settled on a different set of adaptive peaks, these adaptive mountain ranges I was talking about. And depending on which you start out in, you have different adaptive possibilities. And our set of adaptive peaks, obviously humans are possible, and maybe for dinosaurs it wasn't. Another metaphor we could use, this is less scientific and abstract, but maybe illustrating the concept a bit better, is the idea of the tech tree or skill upgrade tree in video games. So in many games, your choices early on constrain your gameplay. In the classic StarCraft game, for example, you can be one of several different races. You can be human, Protoss, or Zerg, and this opens up completely different units with different strengths and weaknesses and different types of gameplay that you need to play to win as that faction. Likewise, in an RPG like Diablo, you choose a character class. So you could be maybe a barbarian, a sorcerer, a paladin, a necromancer, so forth, and each of them has different skills, different vulnerabilities, and different gameplay, and you upgrade as you gain different skills, and your barbarian will never be able to get the skills that the sorcerer can, and vice versa. So in this metaphor, it's kind of like we've switched from the main player being part of the dinosaur faction to the mammal faction, and this unlocks all these cool upgrades like whales and bats and horses and humans, but these other upgrades like evolving giant herbivores and giant carnivores are now shut off. So This is an interesting idea that dinosaurs just have different possibilities open to them. A potential counterexample would be birds. So birds actually do pretty good exploiting small body size, unlike almost all the other dinosaurs. There are lots of really small birds, mouse size and rat sized birds, which most of the other dinosaurs didn't do very well. And they also evolved, surprisingly large, sophisticated brains and behavior in some of these lineages, at least. And so this is mostly within one lineage. This is the Australapes, the group that includes the passerines and the parrots. And in particular, two groups within this larger clade, the corvids or crows and their relatives, and the parrots, actually parallel humans in some remarkable ways. They simultaneously have very large, complex brains, high intelligence. They can, crows can use tools at least. They have a kind of language. They can communicate. They have all these different calls, and they can learn speech. So they seem to have a faculty with language. And they have these very large, complex social groups. So things like ravens and African gray parrots are, in a lot of ways, surprisingly human-like. And that kind of raises the possibility, well, maybe the idea of evolving something human-like out of a dinosaur isn't completely science fiction. Maybe instead of a dinosauroid, to be a corvoid or a psittacoid or something like that. My argument would be that while the smartest birds do overlap with some mammals, like really smart birds are smarter than dumb mammals, mammals still, over 66 million years, evolved larger, more complex brains, higher intelligence, and they did so more often than birds. But this also raises another interesting question, though. The fact that some birds are evolving in a similar way to mammals in terms of getting higher intelligence after the asteroid impact raises another question. Did the asteroid impact change something about evolution? Did it steer evolution in a different direction, not just because of different starting points, but because it's pressuring evolution to go in a different way than it was before? And I think this is a really interesting hypothesis. So this idea suggests that the adaptive landscape has in fact shifted. The peaks lie in a different place than they did in the Cretaceous after the asteroid impact. That maybe different things are being favored. Maybe it's favoring the evolution of intelligence in the way that it didn't back in the Mesozoic. And why might that be? Why would killing all the dinosaurs suddenly mean that big brains and smarts are a good evolutionary strategy, and they kind of weren't before? And it's kind of interesting to think about. And the answer is it comes down possibly to predation. So Lee Van Valen described an incredible fauna from the basal Paleocene of Polecat Bench in Wyoming. And Van Valen is best known for some of his theoretical work, things like the Red Queen hypothesis. But he was also just hugely into these Paleocene mammals, and he would name them in Elvish. He would give them all these names inspired by the Lord of the Rings, and things like Mimatuta Morgoth and similar, and so on and so forth. So all these mammals are named in, is it Sindarin? I don't know. I'm not much of a Tolkien scholar. Anyway, he would name these mammals, and he describes this fauna of this basal Paleocene fauna. And it is what they call Puercan Zero, which is the lowermost stage, the lowermost mammal fauna of the Paleocene immediately after the asteroid impact. And it's in an erosive channel that carves down below the KPG boundary, possibly part of an erosive pulse that happens in the wake of the mass extinction. And it's so recent after the mass extinction that bones and teeth from dead dinosaurs are washing into this deposit. This is one of the reasons they used to think dinosaurs went extinct gradually, but it's just they're dead dinosaurs that had already been wiped out by the asteroid being washed into this deposit. Anyway, he describes this mammal fauna, and it has this really extraordinary feature to it, which is also very, very obvious. And it's the type of thing that kind of takes a genius like Van Valen to notice, because it's so obvious that most paleontologists wouldn't even think about it. What Van Valen notices is the basal Paleocene has no predators. It is basically a predator-free environment, like a distant ocean island. The mammals are all insectivores or omnivores. There's a small lizard in there, maybe about 2 or 3 feet long, a little snake, and maybe they could eat something the size of a mouse, but they would not have been a threat to even a rat-sized mammal. So basically, these mammals are evolving in a predator-free environment, and yet they're evolving incredibly rapidly. And the point Van Valen makes is like, well, if they're evolving very rapidly, clearly they're not evolving in response to predation. They've got to be evolving in response to competition. And so the implication is that we're seeing a fundamental shift in the type of selective pressures that are driving mammalian evolution, from being more dominated by the selective pressures exerted by predators, primarily dinosaurs, but also pterodactyls, large carnivorous lizards, large carnivorous snakes, to the selective pressure being exerted by competitors. So what happens is, without predators, your populations explode. Nothing's controlling your numbers, so you just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce until you come into competition, and basically all the available food is being eaten, all the available territory is taken up, and you start coming into intense competition with other members of other species, but particularly your own species, because they need the exact same things you do. So now the evolutionary game is less about surviving predators than dealing with your competitors. So how does this change things? Well, it may have changed things in a really profound way. So the big way that this changes things, the big way the shift from high predation to high competition changes things, is in terms of reproduction. Think about this. Species under intense predation pressure have to have lots and lots of offspring to ensure that even a couple survive. Think ducks with lots of ducklings, or rats and mice, or rabbits, which, as they say, breed like rabbits. Well, why do they breed like rabbits? Why do they have big litters often and lots of litters? The reason why is they have lots of predators. Rabbits are preyed upon by foxes. They're preyed upon by cats. They're preyed upon by owls, hawks, etc., etc. Lots of things eat rabbits. So if rabbits aren't going to go extinct, they need to have lots and lots of young rabbits. And what this also means is that their reproductive strategy has to be focused towards limited investment in their offspring. If you're having lots of offspring, you're having lots of litters, you can't spend a lot on each offspring. You have a great big litter, you have to have relatively small young, because you have a limited amount of energy and material you can invest in each one. You also can't take care of them for very long because you're constantly having new litters, maybe several times a year. So and what this is called an R-selected reproductive strategy, R being reproductive rate. You're trying to maximize reproductive rate so you don't go extinct because of predator pressure. Many offspring often, but don't invest a lot in them. However, when you have limited predation, you start expanding your numbers until basically all of your habitats and all of your resources are exploited again, and now your environment is near carrying capacity, and the ecologists call carrying capacity K. And so evolve is a K-selected reproductive strategy. Evolve to maximize your survival under an environment that is near its carrying capacity with lots and lots of competition. So what you do, instead of having lots and lots of offspring, if there's lots of competition, you have lots of small offspring, they get outcompeted by things that have fewer, bigger offspring. They're more competitive, so the small offspring can't compete for territory. They can't compete for mates. They can't compete for food. So under K-selection, what you start doing is having fewer offspring, investing more in each one. You have bigger offspring, you might take care of them for longer, you might start feeding them more. And so we have a shift in how things reproduce. And this is seen frequently on islands. So on islands where you have relatively few predators or maybe no predators at all, birds will lay fewer eggs and larger eggs. Galapagos finches have larger eggs and lay smaller clutches than their mainland relatives. An extreme example of this is in New Zealand, the kiwi, which just has this one giant egg, which is something like 30% of the female's body mass. It's just extreme K selection. And they spend a lot of time and effort taking care of that offspring. And the reason why is kiwis are really territorial and aggressive, and they fight each other. And if you want your chick to have a chance of getting a territory, you have to have a great big chick, which means having a great big egg. So what we have is, after the dinosaur extinction, we go from environments that are selected, which favor high reproductive rate and limited investment in offspring, to K-selected environments where the ability to compete in an overpopulated habitat is critical, and you need to have relatively few offspring and invest a lot in them. And we can actually see this reproductive shift. We can't really look at mammal litter size or bird clutch size in the fossil record, but we can look at seed size. And what we see is the appearance of ginormous seeds in the Paleocene. Why is this? Because we're not just knocking out predators of mammals at the KPG boundary, we're knocking out all types of predators. We're knocking out seed predators, insects that would eat seeds. birds and pterosaurs that might eat seeds, mammals that eat seeds. All these things go extinct. So then all of a sudden these trees have relatively low predation pressure on their seeds. And then they have intense competition because back in the Mesozoic, dinosaurs are knocking down trees. The grazing of things like triceratops and duck-billed dinosaurs is opening up a lot of meadows and savannas. And so the trees have, they have to deal with predation by dinosaurs. Their seedlings are getting eaten by dinosaurs, just like dinosaurs were eating the mammals. So with less predation of the seeds and seedlings, you'd have intense competition as these forests grow up and start fighting for light. Well, how do you ensure that your seedling is actually going to survive and thrive in this environment? You have great big seeds. So we see this extreme shift towards K-selected reproductive strategies in the trees, in the plants, but the entire environment is facing this shift towards extreme K-selection in a very low diversity predator environment. So how does this tie into the evolution of intelligence? Well, we start seeing other things appear as well. So one thing we start seeing is the evolution of long lifespans. There's no point in evolving a long lifespan if you're going to get eaten by a velociraptor in a year or two. Mammals didn't evolve to have long lifespans under a high predation environment. Now they start evolving longer lifespans. They start investing more in parental care. Again, if you're cranking out every couple of months you have a litter, you can't invest a lot in your young and taking care of them for a long time. But if you start having fewer young, you can take care of them for a longer time. So you have animals living for a longer time, and we have more investment in young. And these are conditions in which intelligence can evolve. Think about intelligence. It's a really effective strategy. I mean, again, humans dominate the planet. But to do that, we need intensive parental care, and we need time to grow these great big brains, and we need time to train them, to learn all the things we need to learn to take over the planet and make spacecraft and nuclear weapons. That takes time. You can't, and so that type of intelligence can only really evolve once you have longer lifespans and more intensive parental care, taking care of these maybe helpless offspring, these great big heads as they start growing rapidly, learning rapidly in these training periods. Under these K-selected reproductive strategies of long lifespans, intensive parental care, long childhoods, intelligence now becomes viable in a way that it just wasn't before. And so it may be that this environment, this low predation environment of the Paleocene, made possible the evolution of intelligence. And intelligence might also have been favored because, in a high competition environment, it's really important to be able to outsmart your competitors. So maybe it becomes more important in the environment. So basically, the asteroid impact may have changed the game in terms of reproductive strategies, but also favoring the evolution of intelligence in a way that just hadn't before. So we have these two different hypotheses here. Eliminating the dinosaurs allows the mammals with different evolutionary potential and constraints to emerge, and they're just better at evolving intelligence. And you can imagine a game like you've got checkers, and you clear all the checkers pieces off the game, and you start putting chess pieces in there. They can move in a different way. So we're changing the game pieces. The other analogy is that we're not just changing the game pieces, we're changing the game board. And that might be going from, say, a chessboard to 3D chess. So after the asteroid impact, we sweep off the checkers, we start putting chess pieces in. The other possibility is we change to a three-dimensional board. The shape of the board has changed as well. And these are not mutually exclusive hypotheses. It's entirely possible that both of these things are happening. And then this raises another question. Let's say that it is the evolution of dinosaurs that made the extinction of dinosaurs that made our evolution possible. Let's say the asteroid opened up these new evolutionary pathways, either because mammals have different constraints or the evolutionary game itself had changed and it's favoring intelligence. If that's the case, then once this happened, once the asteroid hit and kind of changed the game, was our evolution fated? And again, maybe not. What if the dinosaurs didn't go extinct? Well, even if they did, how likely is something like humans to evolve? Now, ideally, the way to look at this would be to have lots of different experiments. Basically, what you'd want to do is watch the asteroid impact, watch the extinction, and watch the evolution, the aftermath play out, and see how many times does something like humans evolve. And the way you would do that is, I guess, peering through a multiverse. and you randomly sample 10,000 worlds in the multiverse, and you look at these worlds and you study how they evolved in the wake of the asteroid impact. On how many of these 10,000 worlds that experienced an asteroid impact did primates and humans evolve? Now, obviously, we can't do that. That's a thought experiment. We have just the one world to study. We don't have a multiverse. So how could we ever do anything like this? But we do have independent experiments of a sort. We have different continents. We have Asia, we have Africa, we have North America, South America. And all of these are like their own little independent worlds colonized by primates. But they're connected, right? So they're not really independent. Well, this is where it gets interesting with continental drift. For most of the Cenozoic, the continents were separated. Africa was an island continent. South America was an island continent. North America was intermittently connected to Asia. And so these are evolving to a degree in isolation. They're kind of like separate worlds. I mean, it's not quite a multiverse, but we have these sort of independent worlds that are colonized by primates. And we can think of this as a giant continent scale. These are giant continental scale petri dishes running evolutionary experiments, natural experiments. These are independent replicates of an evolutionary experiment, and we can look and see, does anything like humans appear in these other worlds? Now in Africa, of course, which is where we come from, primates evolved into large-brained apes, things like chimpanzees and gorillas. They start using tools. Eventually they evolve into us. So in Africa, here we see the evolution of this strategy of having big brains and language and tool use and complex social structures. What about the other continents? What about South America? Something completely different happens, which is basically nothing. So monkeys get there. They raft across the Atlantic from Africa, and they stage a major radiation, but it's just a radiation of monkeys. They evolve howler monkeys and tamarin monkeys and marmosets and squirrel monkeys, owl monkeys, spider monkeys, just lots and lots of different types of monkeys. But nothing like apes or humans appears in South America. And interesting, two other lineages of primates appear to have colonized South America from Africa, and neither of them evolve into anything like apes or humans. Instead, these monkey lineages just go extinct. Well, let's look at another landmass. Let's look at North America. Several different groups of primates would colonize North America. We have very primitive primates or stem primates like Purgatorius, slightly more advanced forms like the Plesiadapiformes. We have the lemur-like Adapiformes. Where's Adapiformes? I don't know. I'm not a mammal guy, mostly a dinosaur guy. We have a tarsier-like form in Teilhardina, which is a primitive simian. And finally, fairly late, I think in the Miocene, we have the true monkeys showing up. So we have multiple different lineages. It's unclear how many times North America is colonized because it's unclear if the primates are originally coming from Asia or North America. But something like, I don't know, 4 or 5 different groups of primates or primate-like things show up in North America. And what happens? Every single one of them goes extinct. Far from evolving sentient species with hand axes and nukes and smartphones, they just disappear. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that even assuming the extinction of the dinosaurs was likely to produce something like monkeys, the evolution of monkeys is not necessarily going to trend towards something like humans. I mean, if we are such an amazing adaptive strategy, if the human strategy of big brains, tool use, and language is so good, and I think it is a good strategy, why is it the monkeys didn't hit on it more often, only once? Out of, all these different groups of primates that appeared on all these different continents, we're the only one that took that final leap to producing human-like intelligence and ultimately civilization. It only happened once. So Africa seems to be different, perhaps. Maybe something about Africa, some unique combination of flora and fauna and geography and climate, pushed this one lineage of primates to evolve in a direction completely unlike all the other lineages. Or maybe it's just dumb luck and could just have happened in South America and it's the only chance that it happened in Africa. I don't know. Either way, what this implies is that even with the dinosaurs gone, our evolution required some combination of opportunity and or luck. Another way of thinking about it, to use our college analogy, is that one pathway to becoming a multi-billionaire is to drop out of college. That's what Steve Jobs did, and Bill Gates did, and Mark Zuckerberg did, and they're all multi-billionaires. However, dropping out of college doesn't guarantee you'll become a billionaire, or we'd have a lot more billionaires than we do. Even though this is a valuable pathway, some combination of luck or circumstances is needed. It's still quite rare to become a multi-billionaire if you drop out of college. So, conclusions. Dinosaurs showed little sign of evolving towards intelligent tool users and civilization in the Mesozoic period. It is possible that there were intrinsic constraints to dinosaur biology that made it difficult or impossible for them to evolve intelligence of the sort that we have. To play devil's advocate, maybe a far more likely outcome than the dinosauroid would be a dinosaur-dominated ecosystem, which is just giant sauropods and giant theropods, tyrannosaurs and titanosaurs forever. And it's possible that once mammals take over, it unlocked an entirely different set of adaptive peaks, new possibilities, a different upgrade pathway, a different tech tree, if you like. Another possibility is that the sudden elimination of predators across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary may have fundamentally altered the adaptive landscape. Maybe low predation, increased competition, shifting the ecosystem from one that's more R-selected to more K-selected, favoring low reproductive rate, high investment in offspring, long lifespans, and under these conditions, you're much more likely to get the evolution of high intelligence. So it may have fundamentally altered the evolutionary game, making evolution of something like us more likely. That being said, even if mammals had more potential to evolve human-like intelligence, even if the adaptive landscape had shifted in such a way as to favor the evolution of intelligence, something else may have been needed to spur the evolution of humanity. Some unique combination of circumstances or some fluke event that pushed us towards intelligence in a way that we don't see in other primate lineages. African primates uniquely evolved into a species that could make hand axes, nuclear weapons, computers, spacecraft, YouTube videos, etc., and just the South American primates just keep doing the monkey thing, just different flavors of monkey. And the North American primates just went extinct, which kind of tells you, maybe being a primate isn't all it's cracked up to be. So the extinction of the dinosaurs may have been necessary, but probably wasn't sufficient in and of itself to spur the evolution of intelligence. So my sense is that the evolution of human-level intelligence was far from a given. It is entirely possible that dinosaur-dominated ecosystems could have persisted with limited change, perhaps for hundreds of millions of years. And maybe in, other solar systems, other planets, evolution gets stuck at that stage. And they're like giant dinosaur-like creatures roaming around, and you never see anything like intelligence. And maybe that's why we don't get signals from outer space or visitors. The trajectory seemed stable until Chicxulub came along. And this changed the players. But it's also possible that it shifted the playing field, and it may have favored the evolution of intelligence, or at least accelerated it in a way that we really hadn't seen in the Mesozoic. That being said, even if Chicxulub and the Chicxulub asteroid impact made our evolution possible, it didn't guarantee it. Even with the appearance of primate-level intelligence, we see most monkeys just kept being monkeys. And most continents where you get monkeys, they don't evolve into anything like us. So even once you get to the mammal stage where you have these highly intelligent mammals, it seems like it might have been a bit of a fluke or some unusual combination of circumstances that allowed our evolution. So my sense is that if the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct, it's extremely improbable that we would have evolved. But even once they did go extinct, it was still highly improbable that we'd be here. So if you're having a bad day, think about the dinosaurs. They had a much worse day than you've had. And just imagine how incredibly lucky we are to be here.